I'm Flora Lockridge, and I'm here today with my co-host Ulrich Gehmann, the director of Ideal Spaces Working Group. In this episode, we're joined by Dr. Khalid Kadir, a continuing lecturer at UC Berkeley, teaching courses in the Global Poverty and Practice Programme, Political Economy, and Civil and Environmental Engineering. Khalid's research has previously focused on the complex role that engineering expertise plays in the politics of international development and poverty alleviation. His current work focuses on the intersection of poverty, expertise, and politics, topics that we will be honing in on today during our discussion. Khalid is a recipient of the 2017 Distinguished Teaching Award, UC Berkeley's most prestigious honour for teaching. Welcome to the Ideal Spaces podcast, Khalid.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yes, we're delighted to speak with you today, Khalid, and would love to talk to you about the impact of engineering and increased use of technology on communities and human living spaces, with a particular focus on the social inequalities that have emerged as a result of a technical or capitalist mindset. So, as a starting point, it would be really helpful if you could define engineering for our listeners in broader terms, and maybe also explain how engineering relates to social justice or injustice.
Okay, I'll take a stab at that. What I would say is there may be a couple different ways of understanding what engineering is. In my own experience, there's a gap between how engineering is understood and treated from a practitioner standpoint versus from an academic standpoint. My background was in environmental engineering. And in environmental engineering, a lot of the research we do is very much like basic science. But nonetheless, I think that's sort of the outlier. I think the norm within engineering is that engineering is a discipline really about doing things. Many people enter into engineering because they want to do something. They don't just want to think about ideas. They don't just want to sort of contemplate. And they usually don't want to write either. They want to build things. They want to construct things. They want to do things. So in some sense, engineering is interested in the construction or reconstruction of the world. Unfortunately, one of the problems is that within contemporary engineering education, the dominant strand, there's not a lot of conversation about what is this world we are constructing or reconstructing. It's sort of taken for granted that any sort of technical sort of advancement is a form of progress. And I think one of the challenges within engineering, when we think about it in terms of social justice, is the default assumption in engineering is that more technology is progress, progress is good. In the same way that economic growth is progress, progress is good. There's no questioning of the structures of like what actually, in what way are we progressing? Might we be regressing in our sort of technological advancement? And a simple example that I often use with students is, the ability to burn fossil fuels and do all these amazing things as a result was clearly sort of, and still by many, identified as a major marker of how human civilization has progressed. But it might have just helped us progress to the edge of a cliff that we are now falling off in terms of climate change. So is that really advancing us? The other side about engineering and social justice versus injustice, and here there's a classic science technology studies paper by Langdon Winner, Do Artifacts Have Politics? Listeners that are interested in this topic, I strongly encourage them to read that piece. It's an older piece, but it asks this question of is there something political about the sort of engineering artifacts that we create? And he goes through a typology. And he doesn't say, yes, they always do, or no, they don't. But he sort of breaks down the ways in which engineering, sometimes the things we make have within them political ramifications. Sometimes it is how we use them that might determine their political ramifications. So he sort of breaks that down into getting away from technological determinism or social determinism and mixes the two together in different contexts. Now, when we put that together with the question of social justice and engineering, I think it in the same way, not straightforward. Engineering can be a force to promote justice in the world. Unfortunately, it's often not done with a clear vision. There's often not a sense of like, what are the injustices? Instead, there's a sense of we're just going to do engineering, and sometimes we're going to try to do engineering for good. But there's not often a clear sense of what is justice, what are the historical conditions that have resulted in injustice, and how might we use engineering to redress them. So I think that's a big failure point.
Why do you think this has happened? Why do you think engineers have fallen into this habit, I guess, of not really paying attention to the context or the politics?
I think it's partly a product of engineering education, and partly it's a product of the division of labor. To the extent that you're the mechanic, this person's the manager, this other person does this other thing. There's almost a sense within engineering cultures that you play your role, and those other questions are part of someone else's role. That's not your responsibility to worry about. That's someone else's. So even within engineering ethics education today, the dominant strand is still circumscribed by your role in the space you're acting. There's very little emphasis on macro ethics and thinking about what is the larger social context of your work and what do you have to think about if you want to engage in your work in a just manner. Instead, it's very tightly circumscribed by your workplace and the decisions you make on the job and not having conflict of interest and these sort of things, which are important ethical questions, but they're very limited. And so I think engineering education hasn't really done us any favors in helping engineers to think beyond the sort of narrow frameworks.
That is an interesting point, and this relates to my question of the topic of technology, recent capitalism, and social justice. There existed a thesis, the widespread thesis, that recent advances in technology, and in particular in IT technology, are triggering social inequality. Instead of diminishing social differences, first and foremost between rich and poor, they are increasing it. What you could say about that thesis?
My inclination is to agree with it, but I suspect that the terrain is somewhat nuanced and there are ways, let's think of the classic example of everybody, or not everybody. Let me back up and not be so polemical. Many people thought that the rise of social media was going to result in this massive waves of democratization. On the other hand, the rise of social media really resulted in this massive waves of surveillance and tracking. And in fact, that's like core to the business model of most of these social media companies, is tracking and targeting with advertisements and whatnot. And now more recently, we've seen sort of election manipulation across between nations and whatnot. So I tend to think that anytime power gets concentrated, we're going to see wider inequality. Some may argue that's even tautological, that I think that when we see a small number of technology companies putting forth sort of solutions to problems that may not even exist right now, or new ideas, that these, to the extent that they're concentrated in a small number of hands, they're amplifying social differences. And I live in the Silicon Valley. I live in the Bay Area, and the extreme nature of social inequality in the place where I live, to me, is somehow a mirror of the way this place relates to the rest of the world too. This sort of inequality is almost normalized here. And so I think it's somewhat invisible to a lot of the people who are working on these projects. And they're not really engaging with how, like, what kind of world is this building? And is this the kind of world that I want my children to live in? I think that's like a simple question that it would be helpful for people to ask. And I worry that we are amplifying social difference, as opposed to, again, the early days of the internet. This is gonna, and let me even say, this is not a new thing. The idea that technology is going to make us all more equal is as old as the Industrial Revolution, if not older. One of my colleagues, Morgan Ames, gives this just beautiful lecture where she asks questions, or she gives quotes that came together with certain technologies. And she asked the audience, what technology do you think that is? And one of them that really stuck in my head is, because of this technology, the world will forever be at peace. I'm paraphrasing. and people have to guess, what is it? The internet or what? It was the radio. So there was a belief when the radio came about that this would mean we're now going to have world peace, because now we can all talk to each other. We don't have to fight anymore. But this is like the techno utopian sort of imaginary is as old as technology. And I think that the reality of what we've seen is these technologies have enabled the consolidation of power and driving increased social inequality.
But you can see why people buy into it, starting out with the radio and then it was the internet, and now it's social media. Today with Facebook, you can socialize so much more easily. And it's this same promise time and time again that life will be easier, we can do more things. But actually, technology is only really an extension of human will. It doesn't act by itself. So we shouldn't automatically expect it to solve these problems of social inequality unless it's given the direction to do so.
And I would say that it's not only an extension of human will, it's actually maybe a reduction of human capacity. And the example I would give there is I read an article about Facebook in the early days, and someone was pointing out that Mark Zuckerberg, the stereotype story, I don't know the reality of it, sitting in his dorm room, develops this new thing, and in the process of developing this new thing, he comes up with categories. For example, what is your gender? For example, what is your relationship status? And within each of those questions, there are boxes you can check. So now you are stuck within the choice framework of a 19-year-old boy who's in college, right? And that narrows the possibility of what it means to be a person when you're on Facebook. Moreover, to the extent that one lives their life on social media, we live our non-social media lives in ways that are only real when the things we do can show up on social media. So, for example, why would you help an elderly person cross the street if nobody's going to get it on picture? Because what matters is what shows up on the picture. And so there's this sort of like ethical emptiness that can come from that very quickly. And we see the kind of trolling and the ridiculousness that happens on Twitter. And I think there's a way in which social media amplifies certain aspects of what it means to be human and hides other aspects in ways that encourage us to be not as good people. It's the same thing with neoliberal economic models. They bring out certain aspects of our humanity and silence or push down on other aspects. And I think that this is a big problem.
This is a very good point because and this relates also to one basic work field of our idle spaces working group. It's about the basic assumptions underlying constructions, no matter if in technology or in architecture and organization. And these basic assumptions always, in the end, always relate to assumptions about a human condition, generalized, not outspoken human condition, as the conditio humana in classical terms. And what
Yeah.
are the basic, also what makes humans to humans, and therefore why and in which direction we have to improve what or to sustain what. And this is also a question not just of history of ideas, but as I experienced it in my former management practice in very, very practical terms, because these back in the mind theories are determining our realities via using certain techniques, for instance, management techniques, no, to shape reality.
And in that sense, I am a big believer in understanding the archaeology of ideas.
Yeah.
I teach not only engineers, but I also teach political economy. And I approach the teaching of those very similarly. Part of my belief is that when we understand the archaeology of the ideas we hear on the news today, we'll have a better sense of what they're really about. Like, where is this thing coming from? This thing about, hey, could you deregulate XYZ? Well, this is built on a sort of history of understandings about markets that are debated. And if we can understand what the root debate going on here that manifests in a specific claim or statement in the news media, we'll have a better ability to navigate in the world in a way that we understand what we're doing, as opposed to sort of living on the surface and never really understanding the deeper roots of what we're a part of. And I think this is a big challenge within engineering education, is that we don't, like, I didn't have to take a single history class since high school. No one made me. So I did take history classes, but that was on my own accord and actually discouraged, because you should be focusing on your technicals. But it's a deep question of what would it mean to raise a generation of people constructing the world who have not been trained in the sort of history of ideas that inform their practice, and like, what kind of world are they going to build?
Yeah, this is an interesting point also as a question, as basic question in the background also of our idle spaces work. What is the impact of a technical mindedness? If we would summarize it very broadly as a technical mindedness, it's not relating only to technique in the narrower sense, that mindedness, also as regards management, as a technique, the technical mindset is we can shape the world in line with the Bible. Finally, we can shape the world as we want it. And the impact of such a technical mindedness and engineered social injustice, if these both strains of evolution combine, what is this combination on our recent human condition? This is one essential basic questions in the background we have.
It's a big question. It's a very big question. And the thing that I might bring forward to get at a piece of it, is uh is the allure of that technical mindedness. There's something deeply alluring about not having to engage with the social, historical, or political. I mean, this is exactly the reason for the dominance of market-based approaches in the last 40 years. Because why let politics and debate, and why should we decide who has the opportunity to make more money than who? And then we have to, fight in political battles over what's the right amount of inequality and these sort of things. Instead, let's let markets do it for us. And that way, it's a kind of anti-politics, that we don't have to have difficult social debates about what to do with our limited resources. Instead, we can just allow this sort of supposedly apolitical market mechanism, which is, of course, rife with politics, who has power in those spaces and who doesn't. But it gives us this allure of being able to move forward without debating these things. And I think technology does the same thing. Technology promises that we won't have to deal with difficult challenges over who's doing well and who's not and why, and instead we can solve the problem with a techno solution, and nobody has to feel uncomfortable. And I think that that's sort of, sometimes I like to joke that we're all like pathologically conflict avoidant now. We're afraid to have a difficult conversation and work through it, and instead we look for the technological fix to the problems.
Yeah, and it surely goes back to this idea of responsibility. Like, would you say that we can all be held accountable? I mean, if, for example, you search something on Google, you're technically feeding that system. Or let's say if you're a technician that sorts out the algorithms or inputs data, you're also part of that same system. So, how do we move forward if everyone can be held accountable?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are all accountable. And I think that understanding that we are embedded within larger social, economic, and political systems is, for me, like the ground zero starting point for moving forward. In a materialist sense, I think there's a spiritual side to this that I won't get into, but at least not right now. But I think recognizing that we are embedded within systems, and that we have to sort of draw attention and recognize those systems and consider how we are positioned in them to benefit or not benefit in different spaces at different moments, And once we do that, I feel like then we have a chance of making sort of agential decisions instead of just moving along, doing our job, not really thinking about where we're contributing or not to sort of helping people or hurting people. Instead, when we recognize our sort of position within larger systems, we have a chance to take ownership over our own ethics, over our own approach, and say, do I want to contribute in that way, or do I want to do something different? But I think it first requires a recognition that we are connected within these systems, and that we live in relation to other people. We're not independent doing our own thing, but actually the things we do have material effects on others, whether it's what we consume or what we choose to do for a living or how we choose to spend our time. These things are not just abstract, like personal preference issues. They actually have effects on others.
And I think it's quite easy to feel quite disconnected from those issues, especially now, that everyone's working from home and everyone's really shut off behind their screens, getting on with whatever they're doing. I can see why people are kind of becoming quite detached from the overall picture.
There's a real irony there, right? Because on one hand, being detached enables us to move forward in the Western world with lives of great luxury without having to account for upon whose backs these lives are built. And yet they also render us incredibly isolated and alone, right? And so we see this phenomenon of, the appropriation of, in America, the appropriation of Black music or the appropriation of other cultures, precisely because we're lacking something, because of the ways in which we're isolated and we've rendered ourselves sort of separate. Even the way we've constructed our living quarters are so, the single family home, everybody living by themselves, is so isolating and disconnecting. And so we've kind of been the perhaps unintentional architects of our own social and political situation in this way.
That's a very good point. And as regards, as regards the history of ideas in their practical social terms. When we started, also in the Western Hemisphere, as a zoon politikon, a communal animal living in communities in their Greek cities as an ideal, also, but also as a reality.
Hmm.
And then they ended up as liberated individuals ready for consume, and this as a to shorten this process. And this again led, in my eyes at least, led again as a, to this ethical emptiness you mentioned.
Yeah, yeah, it is really interesting. And there's a way in which the sort of, to the extent that our lives are clearly entangled with one another, I think the ethical sort of issues become much more clear to us because we can't isolate from them.
And seen from this background, if we look again in more concrete terms, trying to focus this perspective on the topic of technology, resilient cities and communities, and social justice. Resilience became a new buzzword, replacing the older one of the sustainability. What do you think about the resilience idea in general, as an idea, as a concept? And about, as is this just a luxury topic of high-end Western societies, or can it be applied on a broader scale?
Complicated. I would say, so there's another term that I think is gaining some traction right now that's in relation to resilience and sustainability, and that's flourishing.
Uh-huh.
So there's this, and if you think about the differences between them, right? Like sustainability is maybe the word in the middle. It's like we have some balance, we can sustain this. Flourishing is like, the flower is blooming and things are growing and it's beautiful. And resilience is we're not falling apart. Like we're not totally in crisis. And so there's this interesting spectrum about who gets to think about flourishing and who gets to think about sustainability and who gets to think about or who has to think about how can I be resilient. I think that resilience is an apt term for right now, given the difficulties we're facing with climate change. I think that that's a good word that sort of gets at what many communities are struggling with. In my own work, sometimes I feel like it's a little defeatist, but and I struggle with that, but I'm interested in how might I support marginalized communities to be more resilient in the face of what they are experiencing now and what is to come? And at some level, when I started that down that journey of thinking about that, I quickly came to realize that actually maybe the learning is going to happen the other way around. A lot of marginalized communities are the preeminent experts in resilience. How else do you survive in those situations, you know? And so clearly you've proven that you are quite resilient if for generations post-colonial invasions you're still thriving and managing and getting by, perhaps not in the best circumstance, but it is a symbol of the resilience. And so I think that there's kind of an inversion in the learning for me, that I'm trying to take a different perspective and understanding how, you know, spaces that are sort of defeated on the margins of capitalism are surviving and in sometimes thriving, and what are the things that enable them to do that, you know, the sort of communal support, the kinds of falling back on family and social relations as a way of being resilient have been sort of a great lesson for me.
I really like that change in perspective. This idea that the learning process is often the other way round, and it's not just a one sided process of us helping them, but actually that we can learn those core emotional values of community and attachment. I guess the very opposite of the isolation and detachment that we were talking about in relation to the technical mindset. And resilience for me is often very much about putting up barriers, cutting yourself off from people or a problem, not engaging or being open to change.
Hmm.
But to be resilient in a sustainable way, you do also surely have to be open to change. And the barriers do at some point have to come down. And the question
Mm-hmm.
for me is from which side, and also who takes responsibility for the change?
And who's causing the need for that resilience, right? Like if you're driving your car into my house, then I need to be resilient, but maybe I could just stop you from driving the car into my house in the first place. So I don't need to be so strong in the event that your car comes through the door.
Yeah, that's a very good point. The background is on the one hand this history of ideas. As if we take idea in a vivid way, as a living image we have in the back of our minds, no? Outspoken or not. So we have, as we addressed it already, we have ideas about human condition and so on and so on, and also we have an idea about resilience. And for me, it's very interesting that in times of dissolution of social dissolution as a result of the recent way of a global capitalism, of a technology assisted capitalism, this term of resilience came up at all. Yeah?
Yeah.
It seems the formerly liberated individual has to retreat and to become resilient. No?
Yeah.
There is no longer hope to flourish or to be even sustainable. No, we have to retreat. No?
Yeah.
And we have been invited, this is also the background, we've been invited. To make a one-day workshop at the Italian Pavilion at the Venice Biennale this year, and the general topic of this Italian Pavilion is resilient communities.
Hmm.
No? It's very very interesting. Yeah? No, also why resilience as has get this claim meanwhile.
Yeah. Yeah. It is like one might interpret this as an admission of failure, that
Uh-huh.
we are no longer progressing. We now have to be resilient in dealing with the storm we've created. So at some level, resilience to me sounds like it's a acknowledgement that we're not moving forward. We're just trying to defend from falling
Yeah.
backwards.
That is an interesting interpretation. Also, this is not outspoken resignation in a way.
Yeah.
We
Yep.
are we are no longer progressing. Forget about flourishing and progress. We just have to survive, no? And
Yep.
therefore we have to get resilient.
Yep. And part of it is because the way in which we have grown, and I use that word very tenuously, but the way in which we have grown, and and we've taken risk. We've taken on risk. I mean, you think about just from finance perspective, the goal is to maximize your returns while minimizing your risk in classic financial capitalism. Well, we have as a I don't want to say as a species, because it's not everybody doing this the same, but as a sort of Western industrial liberal project, we have grown by taking on enormous amounts of risk. We've written checks that are now coming to be cashed, and that's where resilience started to become important. So there's this interesting thing about, we focused on this nonstop growth, but in the process, we've taken risk, and now we're dealing with the consequences of those risks.
An interesting point. And another interesting point as regards resilience, which came to my mind, is the relation between resilience and utopia. You can be also resilient in a very radical minded way. You know? For instance, fundamentalist communities are also resilient, or the utopian effort as such is resilience per se. Also, the utopia is the construction of the final society, the end of history as an aim, at least. No? And this is resilience.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. That is an interesting way of thinking about it too.
And I suppose everyone's resilient when it comes to holding on to that one idea or vision for how they want the world to be in the future, which plays into this idea of having these different alternative utopias that you spoke about, Ulrich. So, to wrap up our discussion, if we think about all the ideas we've been talking about today, community in place, technology, accountability, and resilience, what do you think we can expect in the future? Would it be a prolongation of these tendencies? And what approach should we take to move towards regaining social justice or these alternative utopias?
I mean, that question's a setup when you ask someone to tell us what's coming in the future, right?
Yeah. Well, just talking about utopias then made me think it's an important question to ask.
Right. And it is. And I think I will lean on many others who have asserted that the future is, at least from our vantage point, the future is not scripted or written. um we might have a conversation there about spiritually where that lands, but we'll leave that aside for a moment. I think that from I worry that, I mean, many we're worried about what are the consequences of our actions today that we have yet to understand, that are still coming. And actually, I want to bring this back to one other principle, that in the environmental movement, there is this sense of the precautionary principle, to take a precautionary approach to moving forward. And we've really lost that. Tony Judt writes about how as a Western liberal society, we've lost an appreciation for prudence. In fact, prudence is like a joke. We say someone's being prude when we want to make fun of them, and yet sometimes, like, I think it would help us to realize that that's actually a very sort of that conservative approach to moving forward is actually very sort of sound and smart, as opposed to taking risk and then not being able to hold up the end of that. Um, I feel a little lost about where we're going, and I feel a little uncertain. Uh, I worry that there are different strands. On one hand, there's like a doubling down on the approaches to the world that got us into this mess in the first place. Jamie Peck writes about how neoliberalism doesn't fall back, but it falls forward. Instead of realizing, like, oh, that's not working, and let's go back to how maybe we did things in the past and rethink it, it falls forward and doubles down on the mistakes that it made, and doesn't really learn from that. Um, I worry that there's a strand that does that. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who are trying to think about alternative futures, right? Alternative utopias and what they might look like. And there are many who have let go of that sort of Jetsons like fascination or Star Trek fascination of that's where we're going, and starting to think more about, like, where's my food going to come from, and who's going to grow it, and is it going to be healthy, and sort of basic questions that I think folks are maybe coming to think about. How that plays out, your guess is as good as mine. I do worry about the increasing concentration of power that we're seeing in the world today. We're seeing this both in terms of the rise of individuals who are fantastically wealthy at a level we've never seen in the past. We're seeing this in sort of multinational corporations who are increasingly involved in our day-to-day lives in ways that we aren't even aware of, most of us. And I worry about how that shapes the directions we're going.
And going back to engineering, which we started talking about at the very, very beginning, do you see that the technical mindset we talked about, do you see it breaking down in the future engineers that you're teaching and kind of engaging with through your work? Do you see this mindset of not taking context into account and power and politics? Do you see that changing?
There's a classic thing that these changes come like from the youth. And uh so yes, in the short answer, but the longer answer, which I think is important, is that they're coming to my class already seeing that. It's not me who's like bringing that forward. I'm giving them a structure and a way of thinking about it, and a push to be analytically rigorous. But here in the States, we've got protest movements on the streets every week. And that's for a reason. That's because many people are seeing the problems, and students enter the university studying engineering. They're not oblivious to that. And they get into engineering classes which are completely disconnected from that. Many instructors are teaching the engineering classes more or less the same as it might have been taught 40 years ago. And that students are immediately like, what does this have to do with the world? Because I'm seeing all these things happening on Twitter and you don't even know what Twitter is. And so like there's that disconnect becomes very clear quickly, and students are hungry for that. So, and for that reason, I'm hopeful that will bring about change. At the same time, change is not just individuals, it has to be institutional and structural too. And I'm still waiting to see that sort of push upwards on our institutions to get them thinking differently. And we've seen efforts within the tech industry, the unionization of Google employees and the unionization attempts in Amazon. Like, these are movements in directions that bring me hope. But yeah, so I do see that this mindset is shifting.
And I also feel that young people today, myself included, definitely question things more. And technology is becoming a real platform from which that can happen. Because I think we've explored some of the really dark and concerning aspects of a technology focused society today, which engineers a certain mindset, forcing us to be resilient, to retreat, and put up barriers to change. But at the same time, there's this idea of utopia in the background that offers some possible pathways towards a fairer world, or at least gives us insight into people's hopes and dreams for a better future. Thank you so much for joining us, Khalid. I'll be putting some links in the show notes to direct listeners towards an article written by Khalid on engineering social justice, as well as his fantastic animated video for the global POV project, Can Experts Solve Poverty? Thanks for listening, and see you next time.